August 2nd, 216 BC. Late morning in southern Apulia, on a flat plain inside the bend of the Aufidus River. The sun has already crossed high enough that the iron of 86,000 Roman helmets is hot to the touch. There is dust in the air, fine and grey, the colour of wood ash. There is also another smell underneath it. Some of the men in the front ranks have noticed it. Pitch, sweat, horse, and something sweeter, older, that hangs over butcher yards in the summer. A wind is rising. The locals call it the Volturnus, the river wind, the one that blows in off the Adriatic before noon and turns the plain into a kiln. It is blowing into the Roman faces. It is carrying the dust of their own advance back over their own front lines. In the center of the Carthaginian Crescent, the line of Spanish and Gallic infantry is beginning to bend backward. Not break, bend. The Romans see this, and they push. 8 legions and 8 allied legions, the largest single army the Republic has ever fielded, push into what looks like a sagging hinge. They do not know what is on either side of the hinge. They will know in about 40 minutes. By the time the sun is low enough to be in their eyes, more than 50,000 of them will be dead on this ground. By Polybius's count, closer to 70,000. The exact figure is one of the oldest arguments in the field, and I'll come back to it. But on any count, it is more Romans killed in a single afternoon than the Republic had ever lost in any battle, in any war, before or since. It is also the day that 2 named consuls of Rome, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, walk onto a field commanded by a Carthaginian who is 29 years old, and the consul who matters never walks off it. This is the story of how a republic that had spent 200 years learning how to win wars met one man who had spent his entire childhood learning how to break it. Polybius wrote the first surviving account, in Greek, perhaps 50 years after the battle. He had access to the family papers of the Scipios, men who were on the field that day and lived. He set down the deployment, the geometry, the cavalry pivot. Livy, writing under Augustus, took Polybius and added the speeches and the lament. I read both side by side, and the thing that struck me is the cadence. Polybius writes like an officer drafting a campaign report. Livy writes like a man at a funeral. Both of them are writing about the same field. Both of them know how it ends. To understand what happened in that bend of the river, you have to go back 26 months. You have to go back to a Carthaginian general crossing the Alps in October, snow, with 37 elephants and 20,000 infantry, and to the moment the Roman Senate understood that the war it had agreed to fight in Spain was about to be fought inside Italy. The Carthaginian general was Hannibal Barca, son of Hamilcar, who had fought Rome in Sicily during the first war between the two cities. Polybius preserves a story I will repeat with the hedging it deserves. When Hannibal was 9 years old, Hamilcar took him to a temple altar in Spain, made him lay his hand on the sacrifice, and made him swear, in the presence of the gods, that he would never be a friend to the Roman people. Polybius says he heard the account decades later from the king Antiochus after the war was over. That is a long chain of transmission. I think the substance is probably true. I think the staging may have been polished in the retelling. By 218 BC, the boy who had laid his hand on the altar was 25 years old and the commander of the Carthaginian field army in Spain. He attacked Saguntum, a city on the Iberian coast that Rome considered its ally. The Senate sent envoys to Carthage to demand he be handed over. Carthage refused. Rome declared war and assumed the war would be fought in Spain and in Africa. Hannibal had a different idea. He left Spain in May. He crossed the Pyrenees. He crossed the Rhone with elephants on rafts of bound logs lashed together over the current. He turned north and entered the Alps in October. What followed was 18 months of disasters that the Roman state was not built to absorb. At the river Trebia in December 218, the consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus crossed an icy stream at dawn against Hannibal's order of battle, and an army of 40,000 Romans was broken before the morning was done. At Lake Trasimene the following June, the consul Gaius Flaminius marched a column of 25,000 men along a narrow road between hills and a lake on a foggy morning, and the Carthaginian infantry came down the slopes into the flank of a column that had not even formed up. Flaminius was killed in the water. 15,000 Romans died with him. 6,000 more were taken prisoner. 2 consular armies destroyed in 7 months. 2 consuls dead or broken. And the war was now north of Rome, in Etruria, with a road open to the city. The Senate did what Roman senators do when the constitution starts to fail them. They reached for an older office. They named a dictator. Quintus Fabius Maximus, in his late 50s, from one of the oldest patrician families in the city, took the supreme command for 6 months. He looked at what had just happened to Sempronius and Flaminius, and to 25,000 soldiers in the fog at Trasimene, and he made one decision and held it. He would not fight a pitched battle against Hannibal. He would shadow the Carthaginian army through Italy. He would burn the fields ahead of it. He would attack stragglers. He would let the campaign in Italy become a campaign of attrition that Hannibal, with no easy resupply, could not win. Plutarch records the nickname the Romans gave him for this: Cunctator, the delayer. It was not a compliment at first. Fabius's 6 months ran out. The strategy ended. In its place came the consular election of 216 BC. The Senate's mood had shifted. They wanted a battle. They got 2 consuls who would give them one. The Republic gave them both an army. 8 legions, 8 allied legions, 86,000 men by the lower estimate, marching south together in late spring under a command arrangement that I will come back to, because it will fire later in this story. To understand what they walked into at the bend of the Aufidus, you have to understand what Hannibal had been doing all spring in southern Italy, what kind of ground he had chosen, and what the alternating command structure meant on the morning of August 2nd, when the river wind began to blow. The republic that walked toward the Aufidus in the summer of 216 BC was not the republic of the textbooks. It was, in the deepest sense, a war state. It had been a war state for 200 years. It had absorbed the Latin League. It had taken on the Etruscans and broken them. It had spent the better part of the 3rd century learning how to manage one extraordinarily expensive war against Carthage in Sicily, and another against the Greek cities of the south. Polybius, writing later, called the Roman political system a politeia mixtae, a mixed constitution. And what he meant by that is that the consuls, the Senate, and the people each had their own piece of the war machine, and the machine kept producing armies even when individual generals failed. That was its strength. It was also, by 216, what was killing it, because the machine that had absorbed 40,000 dead at the Trebia and another 15,000 at Trasimene was now being asked to produce, in a single levy, the largest field army in the Republic's history. And the men running the political end of that machine had decided that the time for delayers was over. Fabius Maximus had been right. Hannibal, marching through Italy without a fleet, without a secure supply line, without Roman allied cities defecting in any number, could be ground down. Plutarch, in the Life of Fabius, writes that the dictator's strategy had begun to work by the autumn of 217. The Carthaginian army was thinner, forage was harder, the Italian allies had not risen. Time was on the Roman side. But time, in a republic, is expensive. Senators on the Palatine could see smoke from burned villages. Grain prices rose. The dictatorship expired. The campaign for the 216 consulship turned, almost entirely, on one question. Were you for fighting or for delay? Lucius Aemilius Paulus, from the patrician side, was the cautious answer. He had served as consul before. He had triumphed in Illyria. He was, by every account that survives, a man who understood Roman tactics on Roman terms. He was also, and Polybius is careful to record this, the father-in-law of one of the Scipios who would survive Cannae and go on to become Africanus. I read Polybius on Paulus with that in mind. Some of the praise is family loyalty, translated forward into history. But the praise is consistent enough across sources that I think the core is reliable. Paulus did not want to fight Hannibal on flat ground. He wanted to choose terrain. Gaius Terentius Varro was the other choice, and the chronicles do not love him. Livy says he was the son of a butcher who had risen through ambition rather than ability. Polybius is less acid, but no warmer. I will say what I think is true and what I think is later editing. The son of a butcher line is suspiciously neat, the kind of detail Roman aristocratic historians like to attach to populist consuls who had embarrassed the Senate. I lean, with most modern scholars, toward treating it as polemic. What is harder to argue with is the political record. Varro had built his consulship by promising to bring Hannibal to battle. The Senate gave him an army and dared him to keep the promise. The army they raised was almost beyond Republican imagination. The standard consular army of the period was 2 legions plus their allied contingents, perhaps 20,000 men. The Senate authorized, for 216, double consular armies on both sides. 8 Roman legions, 8 matching legions from the Italian socii. By Polybius's count, around 80,000 infantry and a little over 6,000 cavalry. Livy gives a slightly higher number. The exact figure is one of the perennial fights in the field. Either way, this was, in absolute terms, the largest army the Republic had ever fielded against a single enemy. It was also assembled under a command structure that nobody had thought through. This is the first of the small details I planted earlier and the one I want to fire now, because everything in the next 3 days hinges on it. The 2 consuls would alternate command, full imperium, by day. On odd days, Paulus would command. On even days, Varro. Each had supreme authority on his day, and neither could overrule the other on the day that was not his. It was a perfectly reasonable arrangement for a peacetime magistracy where the consuls held court on alternating days in Rome. It was an arrangement that depended on the 2 men trusting each other and reading the battlefield the same way. They neither trusted each other nor read the battlefield the same way. While the Republic was electing its consuls, Hannibal was wintering at Geronium, north of the Apulian plain. He was 29 years old. By 216, he was already not the same general who had come down out of the Alps. Polybius walked some of the Alps route himself, decades later, and his account is the closest thing to a modern after-action report. He gives 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry coming down into the plain of the Po, perhaps half the army Hannibal had set out with. He arrived in Italy with that half, and he broke the Republic with it. Polybius records, almost as an aside, that the 6,000 Romans who broke out of Trasimene and tried to surrender on terms were later sold into slavery on Hannibal's order when their ransom was not paid. I have read that passage 4 times. The thing I keep coming back to is what the chronicle leaves out about what those 6,000 were thinking when the bargain went bad. By June, the 2 consular armies had concentrated in the Apulian plain. Hannibal, watching from his winter base at Geronium, made a decision that was characteristic of him. He did not retreat. He moved closer. He marched his army south to Cannae, a small town with a Roman supply depot near the Aufidus River, and he took the depot. The grain that the Roman state had stockpiled for the campaign was now feeding the Carthaginians. The river was at his back as a water source. The terrain around Cannae was flat enough for cavalry to maneuver, and Hannibal had cavalry, Numidian light cavalry, and Spanish and Gallic heavy cavalry, in a ratio to the Romans that was almost 2 to 1. If the period interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small decisions that lost provinces, this is the work this channel is going to do. There is more of it waiting. Back to the plain before dawn. Paulus saw the position and read it correctly. He wrote in council, and Plutarch in the Life of Fabius preserves the substance of his argument, that the flat ground at the Aufidus Bend was Hannibal's terrain, not Rome's. Cavalry-friendly, maneuver-friendly, the wrong place for a frontal battle by 16 legions, whose strength was the disciplined infantry line. Paulus argued for moving the army away from the river onto broken ground, where Hannibal's cavalry would be wasted. Polybius records that Varro overruled him. That is the alternating day command structure firing for the first time. On the day Paulus argued, Paulus was on duty. On the day they were to march to the Aufidus, Varro was on duty. The decision was Varro's. Varro had been elected on the promise of a battle, and the Senate had given him the largest army in the history of the Republic to fight it with. There was no scenario in which he refused. On the night of August 1st, with the consular army camped on both banks of the Aufidus, with Hannibal's army deployed on the southern bank between the river and the rising ground, with the next day's command rotation set to fall to Varro, the trap was already half closed. The men in the front ranks did not know it. The men in the second and third lines did not know it. The Italian allies in the wings did not know it. Paulus knew it. The chronicle is careful to say so. He knew it the way a craftsman knows when a piece of wood is going to split. And he did what a Roman consul on the wrong day in August does. He woke up at dawn, put on his armor, and went out to face the field. The dawn of August 2nd, 216 BC. The Aufidus is low and brown. The men in the larger of the 2 Roman camps, the one on the southern bank, are eating standing up. The men in the smaller camp on the northern bank, perhaps 10,000 of them, are detailed to assault Hannibal's foragers at first light. The rest, somewhere over 75,000 infantry, will form up on the plain inside the bend of the river. Varro is on duty. Polybius gives the deployment from west to east. On the Roman right, against the river, the Roman cavalry under Paulus, perhaps 2,400 horse. In the center, the infantry, divided into the 4 standard lines but compressed laterally. The maniples were drawn up much more